The monitors had already begun telling a story the doctors no longer wanted to hear. Their steady rhythms were slowing by fractions too small for grieving families to notice, but large enough for seasoned physicians to exchange quiet glances across the trauma bay. Outside the glass walls of the military intensive care unit, 3 battle-hardened men stood motionless in civilian clothes, each carrying scars that had once earned medals, but now felt meaningless against the helplessness of watching their closest friend disappear one breath at a time. No enemy bullet had finished him. No hidden explosive had taken him. After surviving years as one of the Navy's most respected SEAL snipers, after returning from missions few people would ever know existed, he was losing the only battle he had never trained for. The fluorescent lights reflected against polished floors that smelled faintly of antiseptic and fresh coffee, creating a strange calm that clashed with the tension hanging over every heartbeat inside the room. Lieutenant Commander Nathan Cross lay perfectly still beneath white hospital sheets, his powerful frame reduced by weeks of surgeries and complications that refused every treatment modern medicine could offer. Tubes disappeared beneath blankets. Monitors blinked in patient rhythm. Machines breathed with him because his own body had forgotten how to trust itself. Every specialist who entered his room left carrying another unanswered question. Every skin looked worse than the one before it. Every consultation ended with another carefully chosen phrase, designed to soften impossible news. They spoke about neurological trauma. They spoke about inflammation. They spoke about unpredictable recovery windows. What they avoided saying aloud was simpler and far heavier. They did not believe Nathan Cross was coming back. At precisely 8 that morning, the attending physician closed another chart and exhaled through tired shoulders. His name was Dr. Samuel Reeves, a trauma expert whose confidence had rescued countless patients over 3 decades of service. Today, even his certainty sounded exhausted. He looked toward the gathered specialists before speaking in a voice low enough to protect hope from unnecessary pain. We continue supportive care, but we should prepare the family for the possibility that further intervention may no longer change the outcome. No one argued. Silence became the loudest agreement in the room. Beyond the glass, Nathan's teammates understood enough from the expressions alone. Marcus Hale folded his arms tighter across his chest. Elijah Boone lowered his head. Victor Lawson stared through the window without blinking. They had watched Nathan remain perfectly calm while enemy fire cracked inches from his face. They had trusted him to make impossible shots that brought entire teams home alive. Watching Doctor surrender felt far more frightening than any battlefield they had ever crossed together. Marcus finally spoke, though no one seemed to hear him except the other 2 men beside him. He is still fighting. He always fights. The words hung in the air with quiet desperation. A nearby nurse offered a sympathetic smile before continuing down the hallway, accustomed to families clinging to miracles after medicine had exhausted its answers. Yet this was no ordinary family, and Nathan Cross was no ordinary patient. His military file remained partially classified. Visitors arrived wearing uniforms with no visible insignia. Conversations stopped whenever unfamiliar faces approached. Security personnel rotated through the ward more often than hospital administrators could explain. Even among the staff, rumors traveled faster than facts. Some believed he had survived 14 deployments. Others whispered he once protected diplomats in places that officially never existed. None of it mattered now. On the hospital bed rested only another fragile human being suspended between memory and oblivion. That same morning, a new nurse reported for her first shift in the military critical care unit. Her name was Emily Carter. At 28, she carried herself with quiet confidence rather than youthful ambition. She listened more than she spoke. She noticed details other people overlooked. During orientation, several nurses apologized in advance for assigning her the hardest patient on the floor. Emily simply nodded. Hard patients rarely frightened her. Years spent caring for veterans had taught her something textbooks never could. The body often surrendered long after the heart decided whether to stay. She washed her hands, reviewed Nathan's chart carefully, and stepped into his room without expectation. Everything appeared exactly as documented. Oxygen saturation remained unstable despite support. Blood pressure required constant adjustment. Neurological responses were minimal. Every measurement confirmed the same bleak conclusion. Still, Emily lingered longer than required. She studied the room, rather than only the machines. Photographs rested beside the window. One showed 4 young men laughing beside a helicopter coated in desert dust. Another captured Nathan, holding a fishing rod with an elderly couple, whose smiles carried unmistakable pride. A folded American flag sat carefully protected inside a wooden display case. Beside it rested a small metal compass scratched from years of use. None of those items belonged in a medical report, yet together they described a life larger than laboratory numbers. Emily adjusted an intravenous line before lightly touching Nathan's wrist to check circulation herself, instead of relying only on electronic readings. His skin felt cool but not lifeless. Something about the tension remaining in his hand caught her attention. It was subtle, almost impossible to explain, as though the muscles still expected responsibility even while unconscious. She gently repositioned his fingers and noticed faint calluses along his trigger finger and palm, reminders of years behind a precision rifle. Then she saw something tucked beneath the folded blanket near his personal belongings. It was a weathered black paracord bracelet attached to a small steel plate no wider than a thumb. Hospital staff had removed it before surgery and placed it with his possessions, assuming it carried sentimental value. Emily picked it up only to move it into a safer place. Before setting it down, she noticed engraved letters worn smooth by countless years against skin. They did not spell his name. They did not list a rank. They contained only a single call sign. Ghost 7. She repeated the word silently, surprised by how personal they felt compared with the sterile labels surrounding every other object in the room. At that moment, Dr. Reeves entered with another resident. He noticed the bracelet in Emily's hand and offered a tired smile. Personal effects usually become more important to families than patients in situations like this. Best leave them untouched. Emily nodded respectfully and returned the bracelet exactly where she found it. Still, the engraving lingered in her thoughts. Ghost 7. Not Lieutenant Commander Cross. Not Nathan. A name earned somewhere far beyond hospital walls. The day continued with its familiar routines. Medication adjustments. Laboratory results. Consultations. Specialists arrived and departed. Nathan remained silent through all of it. By evening, the intensive care unit settled into its quieter rhythm. Visitors had gone home except for the 3 former teammates, still refusing to leave. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Dim hallway lights replaced the brightness of daytime. Emily began her overnight observations, while the rest of the ward drifted into hushed routine. She checked every monitor one final time before standing beside Nathan's bed. For several long seconds, she simply watched him breathe with mechanical assistance. Then she remembered something an elderly combat veteran had once told her years earlier. Never assume silence means they cannot hear you. Sometimes hearing is the last road home. She looked once toward the empty hallway, reached carefully for the bracelet, and wrapped her fingers around its worn cord. Leaning close enough that only one unconscious soldier could hear, she spoke barely above a whisper. Ghost 7, your team is still waiting for you. Before she could straighten back up, Nathan's right index finger moved with slow, unmistakable purpose, pressing once against the mattress as though answering a call only he had recognized. Outside the room, one of the monitors changed its rhythm, and every person within earshot turned toward the sound. No one spoke for several seconds after the monitor's rhythm changed. The sound itself was not dramatic. It was only a slight acceleration in Nathan Cross's heartbeat, a subtle shift that would have meant little to anyone unfamiliar with intensive care medicine. Yet inside that room, where every decline had been measured with painful precision, even the smallest improvement felt impossible. Emily kept her eyes fixed on Nathan's hand, wondering if exhaustion had deceived her. Then his finger twitched again, not with a random fluttering of damaged nerves, but with deliberate intention, as though someone beneath layers of unconsciousness had heard a familiar voice and reached toward it. Dr. Samuel Reeves stepped quickly to the bedside. His movements were calm, practiced, almost mechanical, but the curiosity in his eyes betrayed years of experience being challenged by something he could not immediately explain. He examined Nathan's pupils, checked the monitor readings, and gently pressed against his shoulder. There was no further movement. The heartbeat settled again, though not quite as weakly as before. Around him, the other physicians exchanged uncertain glances. One resident quietly suggested it might have been a reflex caused by spinal stimulation. Another agreed before anyone could disagree. Medicine preferred explanations it could measure. Emily said nothing. She simply looked down at the bracelet resting once more beside Nathan's belongings. Ghost 7. The word seemed heavier now than engraved steel should have allowed. Outside the room, Marcus Hale had already noticed a change in activity. The moment the doctors gathered around Nathan's bed, he was at the glass door with Victor Lawson and Elijah Boone close behind. Years of military discipline kept them from barging inside, but concern radiated from each of them. Marcus caught Emily as she exited a few minutes later. His voice remained controlled, though barely. Did something happen? Emily hesitated. She had no proof that what she witnessed meant anything medically significant, yet denying it felt dishonest. I spoke to him, she answered quietly. His finger moved. Marcus stared at her, without blinking. What did you say? Emily glanced toward the bracelet still visible inside the room. I whispered his call sign. The expression on Marcus's face changed so suddenly that she almost stepped backward. He looked at Victor, then Elijah, each recognizing something without needing words. Finally Marcus turned back toward her. Nobody here should know that call sign. Emily admitted she had only seen it engraved on the bracelet. Marcus slowly exhaled. Ghost 7 wasn't just a nickname, he said. It was the only name Nathan answered to during operations. Sometimes weeks passed without anyone speaking his real name. Hearing it meant one thing. Your team is here. You're safe. Come home. Before Emily could respond, Dr. Reeves called her back inside. Throughout the rest of the evening, Nathan's condition remained medically unchanged. The scans revealed no miraculous healing. His neurological assessments stayed frustratingly limited. Every measurable indicator insisted the earlier response had been coincidental. Still, coincidence became harder to defend when Emily continued speaking during routine care. She never forced conversation. She simply narrated ordinary things while changing medications or adjusting blankets. The rain had stopped outside. The sunrise would arrive in a few hours. Your friends haven't left. They're still arguing over who makes the worst coffee. Small observations. Human observations. Not treatment. Presence. More than once she noticed tiny changes that machines barely registered. His breathing synchronized slightly with her voice. Muscle tension eased whenever she spoke calmly. None of it appeared dramatic enough for official documentation. Yet she noticed, because she was looking for a person instead of symptoms. The following morning, Dr. Reeves surprised everyone by requesting Nathan's classified military records through proper defense channels. Officially, the request sought additional neurological history. Unofficially, he wanted answers about Ghost 7. The response arrived hours later, heavily redacted. Entire paragraphs were replaced with black lines. Locations had vanished. Dates were incomplete. Operational names remained hidden. Yet one section escaped the censor's pen. Psychological conditioning protocols. During prolonged reconnaissance assignments, Operator Ghost 7 was repeatedly trained to respond to authenticated verbal identifiers under extreme physical and cognitive stress. Dr. Reeves read the sentence twice before placing the file down. Suddenly Emily's observation no longer seemed so easily dismissed. Across the hallway, Nathan's teammates received permission for a brief visit. Marcus approached the bedside first. For a long moment, he simply looked at the man who had once led them through impossible terrain with unwavering confidence. His voice emerged rougher than anyone expected. You remember Alaska. You remember telling us that no one gets left behind because coming home starts before extraction. We listened then. We're listening now. Victor stepped forward next. You still owe me a fishing trip, he muttered, pretending to smile. Elijah said almost nothing. He rested one weathered hand gently against Nathan's shoulder before whispering, We carried each other through worse than this. Carry us one more time. Silence followed. Long, patient silence. Even the machine seemed quieter. Emily watched from the doorway without interrupting. Then Nathan's fingers slowly tightened around the edge of the blanket. Marcus saw it first. His breath caught. Elijah leaned closer. Victor covered his mouth. It lasted barely 2 seconds before relaxing again. Yet this time everyone in the room witnessed it together. No one mentioned reflexes. No one rushed to explain it away. Something was happening beyond medicine's comfortable vocabulary. News spread carefully through the hospital staff, not as gossip but as cautious optimism. The impossible patient had shown another purposeful response. Specialists from neurology requested additional examinations. Rehabilitation physicians quietly asked to remain informed if consciousness improved. Hope, which had nearly disappeared from the ward, returned in careful steps rather than loud celebration. Emily refused to let herself become emotionally attached. Experience had taught her how cruel recoveries could become. Patients sometimes improved only to decline again hours later. Families built entire futures upon tiny victories that vanished overnight. She reminded herself repeatedly that compassion required balance. Still, every time she entered Nathan's room, she found herself speaking naturally, as though he had merely closed his eyes during a conversation instead of lying between life and death. That evening, while organizing personal belongings for inventory, she noticed something tucked beneath the bracelet. It was an old photograph, folded so many times the edges had begun to fray. 4 soldiers stood together beside a helicopter, younger than the men in the hallway outside. Nathan stood in the center, wearing the same calm expression visible in every other picture. Beside him was another operator whose face felt strangely familiar, though Emily could not immediately place why. Before she could study it further, a quiet knock interrupted her. An elderly man wearing a faded navy jacket stood outside the room, leaning slightly on a wooden cane polished smooth by years of use. His silver hair framed a face weathered by time rather than age alone. Security had already cleared him. He carried no flowers, no gifts, only a small envelope tucked inside his jacket pocket. Marcus recognized him instantly. His posture straightened without thinking. "Chief." The old man nodded once before looking through the glass toward Nathan. "I heard Ghost 7 finally answered somebody," he said softly. Then his eyes shifted toward Emily. He studied her face with growing disbelief, as though searching through memories decades old. His expression slowly changed from confusion to quiet recognition. After a long silence, he whispered words that made every person nearby forget to breathe. "You're Daniel Carter's daughter, aren't you?" The question lingered in the quiet hallway with greater weight than anyone expected. Emily felt her heartbeat quicken before she answered. "Yes, Daniel Carter was my father." The elderly man's eyes closed for a brief moment, as though a memory he had carried for decades had finally reached its destination. When he opened them again, there was moisture gathering at their corners. "My name is Chief Warren Briggs," he said softly. "Your father saved my life twice. The first time on a mountain nobody will ever admit we were standing on. The second time by convincing Nathan Cross not to spend the rest of his life blaming himself for something that was never his fault." Marcus, Victor, and Elijah exchanged puzzled glances. Even they had never heard Daniel Carter's name spoken during their years beside Nathan. Classified operations had a way of burying friendships beneath silence. Briggs slowly entered Nathan's room, removed his old Navy cap, and stood beside the hospital bed. For nearly a minute he said nothing. His weathered hand rested gently against the rail as he looked at the unconscious sniper. "You stubborn fool," he whispered. "You kept carrying a backpack full of ghosts when the man who packed it told you to put it down years ago." Emily watched the old soldier with growing curiosity. She had known pieces of her father's military service, but only pieces. Daniel Carter had rarely spoken about deployments. Whenever she asked questions as a little girl, he would smile, change the subject, and teach her something ordinary instead. How to skip stones across a lake, how to repair a broken fishing reel, how to recognize kindness in people before judging their mistakes. The war remained locked behind his quiet eyes. Even after retirement, he never wore his medals. They stayed inside a wooden box tucked into the back of a closet. When cancer claimed him 4 years earlier, he left behind photographs, a folded flag, and countless silences that no family could completely understand. Briggs finally turned toward Emily. "Did your father ever tell you about Operation Winter Echo?" She slowly shook her head. "I didn't even know the name." He smiled sadly. "He wasn't allowed to. Neither am I, at least not all of it. But enough years have passed that I can tell you the part that belongs to your family. Marcus stepped closer. He had served beside Nathan for nearly 12 years without hearing this story. Briggs spoke quietly, his voice carrying the rhythm of someone reopening an old wound with careful hands. Your father and Nathan were attached to the same reconnaissance team long before any of these boys knew him. Winter Echo went wrong almost from the beginning. Intelligence failed. Weather collapsed. Communications disappeared. They were trapped deep behind hostile territory, with almost no ammunition left. Nathan made a decision that haunted him every day afterward. Briggs looked toward Nathan before continuing. He ordered your father to leave the observation point and escort 2 wounded operators toward extraction while he stayed behind to slow the enemy advance. Daniel refused. They argued for nearly 3 minutes. Finally, Nathan pulled rank. Daniel obeyed. Hours later, an explosion destroyed the ridge where Nathan had been fighting. Nobody believed anyone could survive it. Emily listened without moving. Briggs continued. Your father spent months believing Nathan was dead. Nathan spent months believing Daniel had been killed trying to reach the extraction zone. Neither knew the other had survived until years later. By then, both men had already convinced themselves they were responsible for destroying their closest friend's life. Marcus frowned, but they eventually found each other. Briggs nodded slowly. Yes, they met again. They hugged. They laughed. They even went fishing together once. But guilt is a strange thing. Sometimes it survives even after the truth arrives. Nathan never believed Daniel truly forgave him for forcing that decision. Daniel spent the rest of his life trying to convince Nathan that he had nothing to forgive. Emily suddenly remembered something. Wait here, she whispered before leaving the room. She returned a few moments later, carrying a worn leather journal she had kept locked inside her apartment for years. Hidden within its pages was a sealed envelope bearing her father's handwriting. On the front he had written only one sentence. For Nathan. Deliver when he is finally ready to hear it. Emily had discovered the envelope after the funeral, but never knew who Nathan was or how to find him. She had carried it through 4 years and 3 different cities, unable to throw it away, yet unable to fulfill its purpose. Briggs stared at the handwriting with quiet disbelief. Daniel planned farther ahead than any of us realized. Emily's fingers trembled as she held the unopened letter. She looked toward Dr. Reeves, who had entered unnoticed during the conversation. Would it hurt him if I read this? The physician glanced from the envelope to Nathan before answering honestly. Medically, I don't know. Humanly, I think some wounds aren't measured by scans. Emily pulled a chair beside the bed. The room slowly emptied until only Briggs, Marcus, Victor, Elijah, and Dr. Reeves remained. Even the hallway outside seemed to settle into respectful silence. Rain began tapping softly against the windows again, echoing the same quiet rhythm from the night Nathan first responded. Emily carefully opened the envelope. The paper inside had yellowed slightly with age. She recognized her father's steady handwriting immediately. Taking a slow breath, she began reading aloud. Nathan, if you're reading this, then one of us has finally become too stubborn to keep avoiding difficult conversations. You once told me that leadership means carrying the blame, so everyone else can carry hope. You believed that sentence so deeply you never noticed what it was doing to your own heart. I followed your order that day because you were right, not because you forced me. The lives we saved belong to both of us. So did the risks. If I could stand beside you again, I would make the same choice without hesitation. Stop trying to rewrite a day that already gave more people tomorrow than either of us could count. You never failed me, brother. You brought me home. The room remained perfectly still except for Emily's voice. She continued reading through words of gratitude, memories of fishing trips that never happened, jokes about growing old together, and a promise that if either man reached the end first, the other had permission to live without apology. When she finished, nobody spoke. The silence stretched gently across the room. Then a single tear escaped from beneath Nathan Cross's closed eyelid and traced slowly down his cheek. Marcus saw it first. Victor looked away to hide his own tears. Briggs removed his cap once more and bowed his head. Emily reached carefully for Nathan's hand. This time his fingers closed around hers with unmistakable strength, holding on not like a patient reaching for a nurse, but like an old friend finally finding his way home after carrying the wrong burden for far too many years. Morning arrived without fanfare. The first light of dawn slipped through the tall windows of the military intensive care unit, painting long bands of gold across the polished floor while the machines continued their quiet work. Nothing about the sunrise suggested history was about to change. Nurses exchanged reports. Orderlies pushed carts through the corridor. Fresh coffee replaced the stale aroma of the night shift. Yet everyone who had witnessed the previous evening carried the same unspoken expectation. They were waiting for something medicine could not schedule. Emily Carter entered Nathan Cross's room just after 6. She paused at the doorway, not because she feared disappointment, but because she had learned that hope deserved patience. Nathan's hand still rested loosely around hers, where exhaustion had finally overcome both of them hours earlier. She gently checked his pulse before beginning the familiar routine of adjusting medications and recording observations. Then she noticed something different. His eyelids were moving beneath the harsh hospital lights. Small movements, deliberate movements. She leaned closer without speaking. Another second passed. Then, with visible effort, Nathan opened his eyes. They struggled against the brightness at first, unfocused and distant, searching through a world that no longer looked familiar. Emily did not rush to ask questions. She simply smiled with quiet relief. "Welcome back," she whispered. Nathan's gaze slowly settled on her face. His lips parted, but no sound came. Weeks of ventilation and injury had stolen his voice. Emily understood anyway. She squeezed his hand once. "You're safe. That's all you need to know right now." The monitors continued their steady rhythm, stronger than anyone had heard in weeks. Emily pressed the call button. Within moments, Dr. Samuel Reeves entered, followed by nurses, specialists, and Nathan's 3 teammates, who stopped in the doorway as though afraid that walking too quickly might shatter the moment. Marcus Hale was the first to speak. He laughed once, though tears immediately followed. "You always did hate being late." Nathan turned his eyes toward him. Recognition arrived slowly but unmistakably. His exhausted face could not manage a full smile, yet something softer appeared. "Peace." Dr. Reeves completed his neurological examination carefully. Nathan responded to commands. He tracked movement. He recognized familiar faces. Recovery would be long, uncertain, and physically demanding, but the impossible prediction that had hovered over the room only days before no longer belonged there. When the examination ended, the physicians quietly stepped outside to discuss treatment plans. None of them spoke about miracles. They spoke about unexplained neurological responsiveness, emotional stimulation, rehabilitation strategies, and remarkable resilience. Medicine had done everything it knew how to do. What finally reached Nathan had come through a doorway no machine could measure. Later that afternoon, when the room had grown quiet again, Nathan's voice returned as little more than a strained whisper. Emily leaned close enough to hear. The first word he struggled to form was not doctor. It was not water. It was Daniel. Emily felt emotion rise inside her chest, but she answered gently. "He never stopped believing in you." Nathan closed his eyes. A tear escaped before he opened them again. "I failed him," he whispered with painful effort. Emily shook her head. "No, you spent years believing that because no one could reach you with the truth." She carefully unfolded Daniel Carter's letter once more and placed it into Nathan's trembling hands. He stared at the familiar handwriting for a long time before reading every line in silence. The room remained perfectly still. Nobody interrupted. Nobody hurried him. By the time he reached the final sentence, tears blurred the ink beneath his eyes. His shoulders began to shake, not from pain but from the release of a burden carried far too long. Chief Warren Briggs quietly entered the room and stood beside the bed. "I told you years ago. Go 7, he said with a gentle smile. "Daniel walked off that mountain because of your decision, not despite it." Nathan looked toward the old soldier. "Why couldn't I believe him?" Briggs answered without hesitation. "Because brave people often forgive everyone except themselves." Silence settled over the room again. This time it was not heavy. It was healing. Nathan reached toward the bedside table where the old paracord bracelet rested. His fingers hesitated above it before Emily carefully picked it up and placed it into his palm. The worn steel plate reflected the afternoon sunlight. "Ghost 7." a name built for survival, a name that had carried him through missions where fear could never speak aloud. Nathan studied it for several moments before looking back at Emily. "I don't think I need this name anymore." Emily smiled softly. "Maybe you never did. Maybe you only needed someone to remind you who you were before the guilt became louder than your own heart." Nathan nodded almost imperceptibly. Outside the room, Marcus, Victor, and Elijah watched through the glass. None of them interrupted. They understood that some victories belonged to silence. Rehabilitation began days later. The progress was slow, often frustrating. Nathan had to relearn strength that once came effortlessly. Every step demanded determination. Every exercise reminded him how fragile the human body could become. Yet something inside him had changed more profoundly than muscle or bone. The weight he had carried for decades no longer followed every breath. He laughed more often. He slept without waking to invisible battles. During physical therapy, he even argued playfully with Marcus over whose fishing skills had declined the most. The nurses noticed that he always greeted new patients before worrying about himself. If someone looked frightened before surgery, Nathan would offer quiet encouragement from his wheelchair. He understood fear differently now. He had survived the kind that no battlefield ever taught him to fight. Months later, on a cool autumn afternoon, the hospital dedicated a small garden for recovering veterans. Trees rustled gently in the breeze, while families gathered beneath a clear blue sky. Nathan walked slowly along the stone pathway, without assistance for the first time. Emily remained a few steps behind, allowing him the dignity of reaching the memorial bench alone. Resting, there was a simple bronze plaque bearing Daniel Carter's name. Nathan placed the weathered bracelet beside it for a moment before resting his hand on the cool metal. "Thank you, brother," he whispered. Emily joined him quietly. Neither felt the need to say much more. Some promises were fulfilled without speeches. Some friendships outlived death itself. Before leaving, Nathan picked the bracelet up once more, but slipped it into his pocket instead of fastening it around his wrist. It had become a memory instead of an identity. As they walked away from the garden together, Emily glanced back at the empty bench shining beneath the afternoon sun. She realized the greatest healing she had witnessed had never appeared on a medical chart. It had happened in the quiet space where forgiveness finally reached a man who had stopped believing he deserved it. Sometimes the strongest heartbeat returns because someone finally gives it permission to stop carrying yesterday. Long after the surgeries are forgotten and the medals gather dust, people rarely remember the precise moment a life was saved. They remember the person who refused to stop speaking hope into the silence. And if this story stays with you after the final word, perhaps carry that reminder into someone else's difficult day, because the kindness you quietly offer today may become the reason another heart finds its way home tomorrow.